Anybody like that movie? I was just saying, this is only our third Screen Times event where we've actually screened a whole film, and so we're really grateful to y'all for being here with us tonight. It's a real pleasure to kick it off with something we love. My first question was whether the kids were going to be sort of egotistical child actor monsters, right? Are they going to be horrible people given your immense talent on screen, whether or not it had gone into your heads or not? It seems like it has completely. Last backstage Definitely. Was awful.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, no.
You don't even want to hear about it.
Yeah. Were they just terrible people to work with, these two?
Awful. Egomaniacs. No, these guys are amazing people, and absolutely Millicent Simmons, who couldn't be with us tonight. She's shooting her second feature film within 2 years, playing a deaf girl. She's a deaf kid in real life. And so she was the unknown. She was the discovery because she'd never acted before. These guys have both had experience, but it took a real hands-on effort on the part of my casting team to find Millie and to find these incredible kids. But no, these guys were fantastic to share the process with, and they were so prepared, so smart, so engaged. Full of ideas, and it was an amazing experience.
You had to fake being friends. Was that hard? It seemed backstage like that must have been really difficult.
Yeah, we used to fight all the time offset. Yeah.
No. Not at all. We became really good friends.
Yeah.
He's a great kid and a great actor and so much younger, I really enjoyed convolging our ideas together and building the characters, and I don't know, it was a lot of fun to work with him.
Yeah, he was just awesome.
We need some vocabulary tests.
I realize one of the fun things about screening a film before a lot of people have even know much about it is that you don't know much about it. So maybe we could explain a little bit about where this comes from. It's based on a book by Brian Selznick, who also wrote The Invention of Hugo Cabaret, which Scorsese adapted. This book is told in sort of two narratives. Would you like to maybe explain a little bit about the book, or Todd, or I don't know, any of you? What's up with where this came
from? So the book is really a beautiful, beautiful book, and I was actually familiar with it because I know Brian Selznick from the children's book world, and half of the story is told in illustrations, the other half is told in language, and the half that's told in illustrations is set in 1927, and the language part is 1977. At a certain point, the stories merge, and the words and the pictures come together, really magically, absolutely beautifully. And when I was talking to Brian about his book, he said, I really want Todd Haynes to direct it. I said, are you kidding me? I said, Todd does his own stuff. I can't imagine that, because generally Todd develops his own stuff, writes it and stuff. But he was working on Hugo with Sandy Powell, who's our costume designer, and Sandy then introduced him to Todd, and Todd loved it, and that's how it came about. So Brian kind of manifested it.
Yeah. Thank you for that, by the way.
Well done.
And for you, it's not just that you were adapting someone else's book, that you were also adapting somebody's images. What was that process like of adapting essentially someone else's storyboards?
Well, the cool thing is when I first read it, I read the script before I read the book.
Okay.
And already it had moved away from being a graphic novel experience and an illustrator's idea of a story. And because Brian really was bitten by the cinematic bug, and he really started to think about how to make this a cinematic experience. And of course, cinema is part of the content, particularly of the, exclusively in the 20s story, Rose being a lover of movies, and this beautifully observed moment, this just transition from silent to sound films that segregated the deaf community from that universal experience of watching films. And so film was part of the content, but he paid such acute attention to how the two strands would work together, what the sound would be like. So he was already moving into a direction that that was infectious to me. And I loved the illustrations, but I felt like we were already moving toward film. And so I started watching a lot of films and preparing for it the way I do with most of my films, which is a lot of research, a lot of looks back at cinema language.
Yeah. And and for the two of you, you get a good look at a whole different kind of New York that was very different from the Times Square that you just walked out of to come into here. You walk out into, 1979 New York. What surprised you about 1979 New York?
1977.
77.
New York.
Very important.
Told you they were jerks.
The moment my character steps out into pretty much Times Square and out of Port Authority onto the streets of New York in 1977, that was the moment that my character really finds that wonderstruck, and he becomes wonderstruck, and that's, I think, pretty much what Brian was trying to find in that moment, and I thought that was really amazing in Todd's adaptation of Brian's script, and just how that all flowed into that 1977 New York City was different from anything else I have ever seen.
Yeah.
For me, it was more like I previously worked on a TV show called The Get Down with Baz Luhrmann that was on Netflix, and that too was based on 1977 and that same kind of month during the blackout. And, but this is Netflix, you can do some crazy stuff, and so they're really empowering the fact that, there's drugs and there's this and there's, partying hard. And, this is more like a child-oriented kind of film, so they got to dial that down. They want to keep it PG-13. No, but I really kept that in mind while I was shooting everything, like while I was creating the character, that, this is still 1977. This kid is very mature for his age because, he's been through some things. He comes from divorced parents. His, he lives in a basically apocalyptic time of New York City where, it's asking the government for money because it's broke. And, that's basically the MO of everyone living there. And so I just kind of thought, like, this is a time where all New Yorkers are kind of like finding themselves. They're discovering who they are. And my character is probably like not mixing with them because he hasn't found himself. He's kind of like in a limbo town where he doesn't really know where he belongs, And that's why he documents all of his memories with his Polaroid. And I think that's why he mixes so well with Ben because he doesn't know where he belongs. Ben doesn't know where he belongs. Jamie doesn't know where he belongs. And so they really mesh. And so I just kind of kept that in my mind while I was shooting and everything. Like, this kid he's been through some stuff and he's, yeah. Oh, but back to the fact that, I really enjoyed I really enjoyed how everything came together. I really enjoyed looking at New York City in this kind of new kind of way and this new kind of mentality, which is much different from what I'm living through right now. And, it's a much more mature version of 1977.
Everyone in that time was just in a lot less technological state, and everything was a lot harder to do back then, and it's just, I think that kind of rubs off in the film, how the deaf culture has a lot, it's a dark time for not only the deaf culture, but everybody in the 70s.
And in the 20s.
I mean, this brings up something I was thinking of, which is that, there's a certain way of, there's a certain way of telling stories to kids, right? Where they get dumbed down. Like you all go to the movies sometimes and you see a film that you think underestimates kids. As your answers prove, young people have a lot going on and have a lot of opinion and can handle a lot of information. I wonder, for you making a film that is about kids, young protagonists for kids that'll come see this movie hopefully, how much of that question of accessibility do you have to think through and to kind of I wonder if you maybe had to fight for it a little bit to say this. We're going to take some stylistic chances with this.
This was a unique experience. This is an interesting moment with Amazon, who have tried to put together a film division that really reflects the spirit of New York City independent filmmaking. And in fact, the staff of Amazon is sort of our little mini history of people Julie and I have been working with for years. And they really dug the script, and I didn't really have to fight too much. I mean, I think I had more of a confidence that this film could connect to young audiences, and that kids deserve something of complexity and beautiful craftsmanship and sophistication, and that they maybe don't get that as much, and that in general our culture is sort of infantilized in so many ways, from Marvel comics to emojis to whatever. Disney, just the culture in general is going, and our president and all kinds of other examples of infants in positions of power and influence. And this was something really, something antithetical to that I thought kids could really embrace. And so far, what we've been seeing, and I also showed we would show the cuts as we were working on the film. It's such an editorial project. It's all about the interaction between these two stories. We'd bring kids in and we'd show them cuts of the film as we were going along and ask them questions and hear what they had to say, and it really helped guide that process.
Yeah, and Todd doesn't diminish the experience of childhood, of the desires, of the yearning, of the need to find something. And here are these kids who, at different time periods, ostensibly go to New York City to find a parent and end up finding their culture, which is what's so beautiful about it, And that culture goes across that time period, that whole time span.
Yeah.
Which you don't see in kids. You don't see them looking for culture. So much nowadays. It's more looking for toys and exactly, really, iPads and technology.
Mm-hmm. And one of my favorite parts about working on it is it's about children in adult situations and how they take these roadblocks that have just been thrown at them and all these crazy things that have been going on in their lives, and they just deal with it. Yeah. And that's the truth about children, in my opinion, that if you throw them with something, they'll take it. And they'll take it, and they'll use that to sculpt themselves. In other words, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. So
Mm-hmm. Oh, it's really true. I agree.
These are good answers, y'all. Julianne, you get to be a silent film actress. How would that feel?
Fun, I mean, one of the things I'm saying repeatedly is that we were, in a sense, learning two languages, the language of silent film and the language of deaf culture. Mm-hmm. And in terms of silent film, I was, of course, playing a silent film actress, but within a silent movie, so there were things that I need to study specifically. There were a list of movies that Todd gave me to look at, and we kind of modeled the character on Lillian Gish, who was the most naturalistic and expressive of the silent film stars. But it was wonderful to have. I mean, Todd's always so scrupulous in his research, so specific in detail, and it was great to look at these, like to watch The Crowd and to watch The Wind and Blossom and all these fantastic films, and have an opportunity like that to make our own silent film, which we did in pre-production, which was kind of crazy. We just had a day with a big wind machine and silent film.
And I hadn't realized, it's such a sort of a traumatic experience for Millie when you see the sound films coming in, and you know that she's losing this thing that was this relationship that was special to her. And can you talk about the role that played with the deaf community in terms of film shifting at that moment in 1927?
Well, I'm not sure how much. I think this was an insight of Brian Selznick's. I think this was I don't know how much deaf people today think about the moment from silent film to sound as a severance of a popular experience that they were a part of because it's so many years ago. But what the two halves of the story really do describe is these two moments in the history of deaf teaching in America, from what I've researched, where there was sort of a progressive period after Helen Keller. But Alexander Graham Bell had deaf people in his family that he was greatly ashamed of. And he became a spokesperson for not teaching sign language.
Making them read lips.
Read lips and speak. So oralism became the mode of education that was sort of enforced by the education system from the teens all the way really up through the 50s. And then in 1960, an article came out that actually talked about the integrity of sign language as a real language with the complexity and the syntax and the nuances and the grammar of any language. And it ushered in a new era of awareness of the deaf community, teaching sign language and giving them back their language. And I think I was aware of this in the 1970s, a kind of renaissance where sign language was cool, even to the hearing community. We all wanted to learn it, and it felt like there was a shift. And so this film also straddles these 2 points in the history of deaf experience in a really poignant way. And in fact, neither kid in the movie uses sign language. Rose isn't exposed to it yet, and Ben only just became deaf. And ironically, it's the hearing kid, the product of the New York City public school system of the 1970s, who knows sign language. So they're figuring out ways of communicating kind of as you're watching it happen on the screen. And it's kind of an improvisation, but they figure it out.
Yeah. And I'd be curious to hear all the actors talk about that experience. So if we're talking about a kind of deaf language that you're creating for your performance, what is that? How do you find that?
Well, for me specifically, I was learning ASL. So I had a teacher named Alexandria Wales, who is a deaf actress and would just come and knock on my door and would only speak to me in American Sign Language. So I didn't know. She comes from a hearing family, so she does have a voice and she does use it. She's great at reading lips, but she refused to speak in anything but ASL. And she'd write things down too. And it was amazing. It was fascinating. And the first thing she asked me was, did I know the history of American Sign Language or the history of deaf culture in the United States? I was like, I barely understand what you're saying. But it was really, she really threw me in the deep end in terms of what the language was. And first she taught me, when we were learning sign, she taught me sign in English. And then once I had learned the sentence structure in English in sign, then we went back and learned the syntax in American Sign Language, because it's a whole different kind of grammar. So it was much more immersive than I thought it would be. I've come away with a little bit. You don't retain much. It's too brief to really retain the language. And but it was fascinating, because it's not just like learning a few phrases of French. You're learning the history of a culture. Mm-hmm.
And for the two of you, what was the experience learning how to play these characters?
For me, because I'm a hearing character that becomes deaf, and living in Minnesota, I didn't learn sign language at all and had no exposure to it, so I had completely none in this film. And then actually, when I meet Jamie, he tries to teach me sign language, and I'm like, I don't know sign language. Mm-hmm. And then he teaches me how to speak the alphabet, or sign the alphabet, sorry. And that kind of has a bonding experience for both of us. But creating that deaf character through the deaf culture is very important. And you need to kind of filter it in through sign language. Is a really great way to do that.
It's such a great performance. And I know that you did some exercises early on where you were trying to figure out what it feels like to move through the world without being able to rely on this other sense. Could you maybe talk a little bit about what that was like?
So just after I had really met Todd and talked to him for a little bit, we met with a couple of Brian's deaf friends, and we talked to them and asked them questions about how it felt and if it was scary and how it just all flowed in their world. And then we went on a long walk through New York City around our production office with noise cancellation headphones and earplugs to try to simulate being deaf. And in no way it was perfect, but it definitely was close enough, and it helped us kind of see the difference that you really find in that. And it was really a moment of wonderstruck for me, which carried over into all of Ben. So that's kind of how I developed a character.
Yeah. And the two of you meet in the Museum of Natural History, which is such like a magical place in sort of New York mythology, right? And it was, I was just there the other day. There's something that's very odd about that museum. Why do you think people keep returning to this particular museum?
It's history.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't you?
We have a lot of museums. We have a lot of very good museums.
It's a part of culture that you don't really get to, that you can't read. In a movie, you can see certain things that you can't read in a book. And so if you're reading textbooks, right, all day long, you're going to become book smart. But if you go to the museum, you really get indulged into,
it's the culture.
The culture, and, you could, see things. You could see how the wolf was running rather than reading how the wolf was running. And so I think that's one of the most, what makes it so special for me, the Museum of Natural History. I was born and raised here in Manhattan, so I kind of know what it's like. I go there all the time. My aunt lives up the block from the American Museum of Natural History, so I'm always there. And I don't know, there's something that I love how I can see things. I can, touch things, and I can go to the exhibits. And recently they had a mummy exhibit, and I'm looking at the MRI scanner, and I'm like, wow. Rather than going onto Google MRI scanner, I don't know. There's something about seeing something in your face rather than reading it on a textbook.
Yeah.
The American Museum of Natural History has always been very special to me because I remember the first time I went there with my sister, and it was really awesome because I had never seen anything like that. And going and seeing all the dioramas and seeing everything in that museum, and the massive whale that you'd never see anywhere else but New York. It was, again, another moment of wonderstruck, and it was just really special to me, especially as a little kid. It was really cool, and there's nothing like that.
Yeah.
If you go to the MoMA Museum, what are you going to see? Art. If you go to the Barbican in London, what are you going to see? Art. If you go to the Guggenheim, what are you going to see? And sculptures and stuff like that. But I don't know. If you go to the American Museum of Natural History, you could be your child self again. You could touch around and look and read, and I don't know. I really love it.
I'm curious about something we're not going to have a lot of on this panel, is silence. There's so much silence in this film, and that seems to be a risk, especially in any film these days. For there to be that kind of quiet. I'm curious about what that's like to act.
Only Todd Haynes.
Yeah.
It's funny, I didn't realize, I always knew the black and white section was conducted like an homage to the silent era. But I didn't quite realize how silent Ben's story is until we watched an early cut of the film. And it's over an hour from the time the cousin leaves the room, where dialogue stops. You have the experience with the lightning. And from that point on, it's a discovery where he's pretty much on his own. And it's all the way into the film where he starts to talk, you meet Jamie, and you guys start to talk, and all of a sudden you realize you're hearing dialogue again. But what I hoped is that you'd forget about it, and you start to pay attention to sound. A hearing audience starts to pay attention to sound in a whole different way. We really tried to make the soundtrack, the music, of course, but also the sound design and elements, a really dynamic soundtrack where there are parts where the sound just almost eviscerates to nothing. And then parts of great triumphant score, and with scenes with Millie in the black and white story. But that you really become aware of the subjectivity of being deaf. And also that we knew that there's no such thing as absolute silence in deaf people's experience. There's always some frequency that's felt by different people. And we also imagined in the sound design process that this is a kid who only just lost his hearing, that there might be a memory of hearing or almost like a phantom limb of what hearing was that he's still conjuring in his mind as he's navigating the city, on his own. So all of that was stuff we tried to make the silent parts of the film rich and full of interest for the hearing audience.
And without knowing it, you just answered our first question from Facebook, which was from Colin, saying, what was the inspiration behind the score? So we were one ahead already. Thanks, Colin. We're live streaming at the moment. Melissa from Facebook says, what is your favorite cultural landmark in New York, and do you see it differently after this film? So I don't know, do you have a favorite spot in New York?
Leaker Park? I don't know. I don't. I mean, I don't know if I think the thing about living in New York, I moved to New York City right after college, and it was astonishing to me that everybody was welcome. I still feel that way. I feel it's a place where it's so, you can be anything you want. Nobody cares. Everybody comes here. And yet you have community at the same time. That's the one thing that I found here, where I still, you live downtown, you go uptown, you run into some guy from your block, and you're like, oh, there's something very integrated about the city. It's very unusual. So I never think of it in terms of landmarks. I feel like I almost feel that way about other cities, about Paris or Berlin or London, where you think about those landmarks. But for New York, because it's my home, I think about the neighborhoods and the communities and the subway and the people, really.
Mm-hmm. And the rats.
Always the rats. I rented my apartment once. Someone came in, I came home and saw them taking a picture of a dead rat on the sidewalk. I was like, I'm sorry. They're like, no, this is what we wanted from New York. I wonder, working on a film, do you think about a film differently when you know that kids are going to be watching it? Do you play it differently? Do you direct it differently? Is there a change in the way you approach it?
No.
Yeah.
It's like Todd said earlier, it's a great honor to be able to work on a film that isn't, hey, this is Disney, rather to a Todd Haynes film. It's a great honor to be given the privilege to really be able to create a character that's not a child, that's not an everyday child, or what adults think children do. Like, oh, all children do is go on Instagram and say hashtag. It's like, no, not really. But so you do change up how you act, because if I was doing like a Disney promo or something like that, I would always be fake, as they say, like heightened reality. But for this film, it's all about being real and showing the realness of children and realness of children in these circumstances.
And that's really what Todd encouraged both of us to do, and adapt our own ideas into what we all wanted to do.
Yeah. Do you think, does this open your mind to the idea of making more films, for another film for a younger audience in the future?
Maybe so. I mean, this was such an amazing experience for me in every way. I also got to just work with all my very favorite people, like Julianne, who I've been working with from the beginning of my career. And it wasn't originally scripted that the same actor would play the two roles, Lillian and Rose, adult Rose. And I was like, Julie is, in between these ages, and this could be a really fun way that she touches both parts of the story. But I had my creative team, Ed Lockman, the amazing director of photography, Mark Friedberg, who designed the film. And this is really a film that's almost a tribute to what the production designer does in movies. Like a diorama is kind of like a miniature idea of a set. It plays with a sense of depth and a sense of false perspective, and it's a narrative in and of itself. And that's really, and he grew up at the Natural History Museum himself as well, lived in New York City. And he brought so much to it, Carter Burwell. Sandy Powell, the costume designer, and a lot of the background costumes and people in those memorable scenes in New York City, in both periods, are due to her unbelievable attention to detail and care about the bodies of the extras who were being cast, and the kind of bodies that you don't see anymore. It's a whole different kind of figure that we saw in the 1970s than today in the 20s.
All this waxing. Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. We
so
really
much.
appreciate it.
Thank
I'd like
you.
to thank our cast.